At 1400 hours on January 26, 1945, 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy crouched in a shallow drainage ditch near the woods of Holtzwihr, France, watching the tree line dissolve into a wall of white fire and gray steel. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero, a paralyzing cold that turned the mud into concrete and made the simple act of pulling a trigger feel like breaking a finger. Murphy wasn't shaking from the cold, though. He was shaking from the vibration of 6 German Tiger tanks grinding toward his position, their tracks chewing up the frozen earth like a meat grinder. Most historians focus on the beaches of Normandy or the forests of the Bulge, but the Colmar Pocket was a special kind of hell designed to break the human spirit. It was a flat, open killing floor in the Alsace region, where the winter wind cut through the heaviest coats, and the ground was frozen so solid that digging a foxhole was impossible. You didn't dig in at Holtzwihr. You just lay on top of the ice and prayed you were thinner than the bullets flying over your head. For Murphy, staying low was easy. He was 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 110 pounds soaking wet. He didn't look like an officer in the United States Army. He looked like a runaway teenager who had stolen his father's uniform. But the men of Company B didn't care about his size. They cared about the math, and the math was ugly. Weeks of brutal fighting had chewed the unit down to the bone. Company B was supposed to be a fighting force of 235 men. Looking down the line, Murphy counted 19. 19 exhausted, freezing, sick infantrymen holding a position that required a battalion. They were the last speed bump on the road to the Rhine, and the German High Command had decided to run them over. The attack didn't start with a probe. It started with a sledgehammer. The German 2nd Mountain Division, elite troops accustomed to winter warfare, emerged from the woods in a perfect skirmish line. 250 infantrymen dressed in white snow camouflage moved behind the armor, invisible until they were right on top of you. Leading them were the Tigers, 60-ton monsters armed with the terrified 88mm cannon. The Tiger wasn't just a tank, it was a mobile fortress that could kill anything the Americans had from a mile away. Murphy grabbed the field telephone, his knuckles white against the black receiver. He wasn't calling for extraction. He was calling for the only thing that could even the odds: artillery. He barked coordinates into the mouthpiece, demanding a barrage to break up the infantry wave. But the guns were miles away, and the shells took time to fly. In the gap between the call and the impact, the war arrived at his doorstep. The sound of the battle was a physical assault. The crack of the high-velocity German cannons split the air, creating a vacuum that sucked the breath out of your lungs before the explosion even registered. Trees shattered into razor-sharp splinters, raining wood and shrapnel down on the exposed Americans. Murphy saw his men flinching, pressing themselves into the snow, their Moan Garans looking like toys against the advancing armor. They were good soldiers hardened by Italy and France, but they weren't suicidal. You can't fight a tank with a rifle. Supporting Murphy's position were 2 M10 Wolverine Tank Destroyers. These were lightly armored vehicles with open-top turrets, designed to hunt tanks using speed and a big gun. But on the ice of Holtzwihr, speed was a memory. The M10s were sitting ducks. Murphy watched in horror as the lead M10 tried to maneuver for a shot. The track spun helplessly on the ice, losing traction. The vehicle slid sideways, drifting like a car on a frozen lake, until it slammed into a drainage ditch at a terrifying angle. The gun was pointed at the sky, useless. The crew bilayed out, scrambling into the woods as machine gun fire stitched the snow around their boots. That left one. The 2nd M10 sat exposed on the road, its commander trying desperately to traverse the turret toward the oncoming Tigers. It never got the chance. An 88mm shell from the lead Tiger slammed into the American vehicle. It wasn't a glancing blow. The shell punched through the thin armor like a fist through drywall. The impact didn't destroy the vehicle instantly. It turned it into a furnace. The fuel tanks ignited, sending a plume of oily black smoke rolling into the sky. The ammunition stored inside the hull began to cook off, popping and hissing like a string of firecrackers inside a metal drum. The crew scrambled out of the burning turret, their uniforms smoking, dragging their wounded into the cover of the trees. The line was broken. The armor support was gone. The heavy weapons were gone. There was nothing left between the 19 Americans and the German division except 300 yards of open snow. Common sense and the Army Field Manual dictated an immediate withdrawal. To stay was to die. The experts at headquarters would have looked at the map, seen the mismatch, and written Company B off as a loss. They would have expected a surrender or a massacre. There was no tactical justification for holding a patch of frozen dirt against 6 tanks. Murphy looked at his men. They were terrified. They were looking at him, waiting for the order that would save their lives. They saw the baby-faced lieutenant, the kid who had been rejected by the Marines and the paratroopers for being too small. They expected him to fold. They expected him to run. "Get back," Murphy yelled, his voice cutting through the noise of the shelling. "Pull back to the woods, I'm staying here." The order confused them. Retreating meant moving everyone. Staying behind alone was suicide, but Murphy didn't give them time to argue. He grabbed his carbine and emptied a magazine at the German infantry, suppressing the lead elements just enough to buy his men a gap. Reluctantly, the survivors of Company B broke contact, slipping back into the dense forest, leaving their lieutenant alone on the edge of the clearing. Murphy was now a solitary figure in a landscape of violence. He dropped the empty carbine. It was useless against the armor anyway. He still held the field telephone, the wire trailing back into the trees, his only lifeline to the heavy guns in the rear. He looked at the German advance. The Tigers were closing in, their commanders confident, their hatches open. They saw the retreating Americans. They saw the burning wreck of the M10. They didn't see a threat, but Murphy saw something else. Staring at the burning tank destroyer, he didn't see a pile of scrap metal. He saw a weapon. The M10 was a death trap, flames licking out of the engine compartment, smoke pouring from the turret. It was a ticking time bomb loaded with gasoline and high-explosive shells that could detonate at any second. But mounted on the rear deck of the turret, untouched by the initial hit, was a Browning M12 50 caliber machine gun. The Modus, the 50, a heavy air-cooled beast that fired around the size of a thumb. It could punch through a brick wall at a mile. It could tear a man in half. It was the only thing on the battlefield heavy enough to make the Germans pause. The Germans ignored the burning vehicle. Tactical doctrine said you stay away from burning armor because it explodes. No sane man would climb onto a lit fuse. They swept past it, their eyes focused on the woods, focused on hunting down the retreating infantry. They treated the wreckage as scenery. Murphy looked at the phone in his hand. He looked at the burning hull. He looked at the Tigers. The fear was there, cold, hard, and paralyzing, but he pushed it down into a dark corner of his mind. He wasn't thinking about the medal. He wasn't thinking about heroism. He was thinking about the math. If the Germans got past him, they would roll right over his men in the woods. They would massacre the retreat. He had to stop them. And he had to do it with a gun attached to a bomb. Dragging the telephone wire with him, Murphy ran toward the fire. He didn't crouch. He didn't crawl. He sprinted across the ice, his boots slipping, running straight toward the one thing on the battlefield that everyone else was running away from. He scrambled up the side of the burning tank destroyer, the heat hitting him like a physical blow, singeing his eyebrows and drying the sweat on his face instantly. He hauled himself onto the rear deck. The metal was hot enough to blister skin. The smoke was thick, choking him, stinging his eyes. He grabbed the handles of the 50 caliber machine gun. He checked the belt. It was loaded. He swung the heavy barrel toward the gray shapes moving in the snow. The German infantry were 200 yards away. They were relaxed, confident, their rifles at the low ready. They thought the fight was over. They thought they had won. Murphy racked the charging handle. The sound was a heavy, metallic cycling that was lost in the roar of the fire. He settled his thumbs on the butterfly trigger. He wasn't a lieutenant anymore. He wasn't a kid from Texas. He was the gatekeeper. He squeezed the trigger. Sitting in the gunner's bucket seat with the rain hammering against his helmet, Harris stared at the two hex-headed bolts that stood between him and survival. These weren't just pieces of metal. They were the Army's way of saying that a soldier couldn't be trusted with his own weapon. The depression stops were thick, rusted steel studs welded into the traverse ring, designed to physically block the guns from aiming lower than the hood of the truck. In an airfield defense role, they made sense because shooting your own driver was generally considered bad form. But here in the mud of Luzon, with 3,000 enemy soldiers preparing to sprint out of the tree line, those bolts were a death sentence. Reaching into his tool bag, Harris pulled out a heavy pipe wrench, the metal cold and slick with oil. He didn't ask the captain for permission because asking meant giving an officer the chance to say no. Fitting the jaws of the wrench over the first bolt, he leaned his entire weight into the turn. The bolt didn't move. It had been painted over at the factory and rusted solid by weeks of jungle humidity. It fought him like it was part of the chassis, refusing to break its bond with the steel ring. Gritting his teeth until his jaw ached, Harris repositioned his grip, bracing his boot against the turret housing for leverage. He pulled again, his muscles burning, the veins in his neck bulging against his wet collar. For a second, nothing happened, and then the paint seal shattered with a sharp, metallic fracture. The bolt groaned, a high-pitched screech of metal on metal that sounded like a scream in the quiet perimeter. Freezing instantly, Harris looked toward the command bunker, waiting for the flashlight beam or the shout of a sentry. The rain kept falling, drowning out the noise. Turning the wrench again, he unscrewed the bolt, feeling the threads grind against the rust until the heavy stud came free in his hand. He dropped it onto the floor of the cab where it landed heavily. One down, one to go. The second bolt was even more stubborn, requiring Harris to use a cheater bar, a length of pipe slipped over the wrench handle, to break the torque. When it finally came loose, the turret felt different. It felt unlocked. Testing the modification, Harris grabbed the elevation control handles. He pulled back and the electric motors whined, a low, smooth hum that vibrated through the seat. The 4 heavy barrels of the Browning machine guns dipped. They passed the horizontal mark. They passed the hood line. They kept going down until they were pointing directly at the mud 10 feet in front of the bumper. The safety limit was gone. He could now sweep the ground like a janitor with a broom made of lead. But unlocking the guns was only the first step in the MacGyver solution, because a gun without the right ammunition is just a heavy club. The standard load for the M45 was designed for airplanes, light, fast-moving targets made of aluminum and canvas. The belts were loaded with a mix of ball ammunition and tracers, allowing the gunner to walk his fire into the sky. Against a banzai charge, tracers were a liability. They worked both ways. In the dark, a stream of tracers would point a giant neon finger right at the half-track, telling every Japanese mortar team exactly where to drop their shells. Crawling into the back of the half-track, Harris dragged the heavy ammo crates toward the reloading bench. He cracked the seals, the smell of fresh cosmoline, a thick, waxy preservative filling the humid air. Sitting cross-legged in the dark, working by touch, he began the tedious, finger-breaking work of relinking the belts. He stripped out every tracer round, tossing them into a pile for the infantry to use. In their place, he loaded the eraser mix. He started with the armor-piercing rounds, identifiable by their black tips. These bullets had a hardened tungsten core designed to punch through engine blocks. Against a human body, they wouldn't just stop a man. They would go through him, the tree behind him, and the man behind the tree. For every 4 black tips, he added a blue-tipped incendiary round. These carried a chemical payload that ignited on impact, burning at 3,000 degrees. The plan was brutal physics. The AP rounds would shred the cover, and the incendiaries would set fire to the wreckage. Loading the 4 tombstone drums, so named because of their heavy, rectangular shape, took an hour of sweating, cursing labor. Each drum held 200 rounds of 50 caliber hate. Wrestling the heavy cans into the mounts on the sides of the turret, Harris felt the suspension of the half-track groan under the added weight. He fed the starter tabs of the belts into the feed ways of the 4 guns, listening for the distinct double click of the pawls engaging. He checked the headspace and timing on each barrel, using a gauge to ensure the explosion would happen inside the chamber and not in his face. It was a ritual of competence, a mechanic checking his engine before the race. By 0400, the meat chopper was hungry. Harris climbed back into the bucket seat and powered up the Maxim unit. The small gasoline generator mounted on the rear of the turret sputtered to life, settling into a steady, rhythmic chugging that charged the batteries for the turret motors. He donned his helmet, plugging the communication wire into the intercom system, though there was nobody on the other end he wanted to talk to. Then the jungle decided to test him. The rain stopped abruptly, as if someone had turned off a faucet. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The clouds broke, letting a sliver of moonlight illuminate the fatal funnel Harris had cleared in the brush. It looked like a scar on the landscape, a muddy avenue leading straight into the dark heart of the trees. Suddenly, the generator coughed. The steady chug faltered, the engine missing a beat, then another. The lights on the control spider flickered and died. The electric motors went silent. The turret was dead. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Harris's chest. Without the generator, the turret was a 2,000-pound paperweight. He couldn't traverse, he couldn't elevate, he couldn't fire the solenoids. He was sitting in the open, exposed with a broken machine. Scrambling out of the seat, he jumped onto the rear deck, slipping on the wet steel. He ripped the cover off the generator engine. It was overheating, the tropical humidity choking the carburetor. He didn't have time for a repair manual. He grabbed a rag and soaked it in water from his canteen, wrapping it around the fuel line to cool the vapor lock. He found the mixture screw in the dark, turning it by feel, leaning out the fuel air mix to compensate for the thick air. He pulled the starter cord. The engine sputtered and died. He pulled again, harder, putting his back into it. "Come on, you piece of junk." The engine caught, coughed a cloud of blue smoke, and roared back to life. The lights on the control panel flickered green. The power was back. Harris slumped against the armor plate, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. It was a warning. The equipment was pushing its limits. The heat, the moisture, the mud, everything was conspiring to jam the gun before the first shot was fired. Climbing back into the seat, he checked the optics. The sheer exhaustion of the last 24 hours was starting to creep in, making his eyelids heavy and his hands shake. He wiped the sweat from his eyes and gripped the control handles, forcing himself to focus on the green wall of the jungle. At 05:15, the first sign of the enemy appeared. It wasn't a soldier. It was a sound, a single, sharp snap of a branch breaking, echoing from deep inside the timber. Then another. Then the sound of metal rattling against wood. The infantry in the foxholes heard it too. The low murmur of conversation stopped. Bolts clicked as rifles were chambered. Safety pins were straightened on grenades. The entire perimeter tensed, a collective holding of breath. Harris traversed the turret slightly to the left, the electric motors whining softly. He lined up the 4 barrels with the center of his cleared fire lane. He didn't look through the reflex sight. At this range, he didn't need it. He looked over the top of the armor plate, watching the tree line with his naked eyes. A whistle blew. It was a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the humid air like a knife. It was followed immediately by a bugle, an eerie, discordant blast that sounded archaic and terrifying. And in that moment, the screaming started. It didn't sound like human voices. It sounded like the earth itself was howling. Thousands of throats united in a single, guttural roar of banzai that rolled out of the jungle like a physical wave. The ground began to shake, the vibration traveling up through the tires of the half-track and into Harris's spine. Flares popped overhead, bathing the clearing in a stark, flickering white light that turned the world into a high-contrast nightmare. And in that light, Harris saw them. They broke from the tree line not as individuals, but as a flood. A wall of tan uniforms and bayonets, sprinting through the mud with a terrifying, suicidal speed. There were hundreds of them in the first wave alone, rushing into the fatal funnel, their faces twisted in screams of rage. They weren't using cover. They weren't stopping to shoot. They were running straight at the American lines, intent on overwhelming the defenders with sheer mass. The American infantry opened fire. The crackle of mown Garans and the rapid thumping of Barse erupted from the foxholes, but it wasn't enough. The wave absorbed the bullets and kept coming. Men fell, but the soldiers behind them jumped over the bodies, closing the distance with frightening speed. 50 yards, 40 yards. They were going to overrun the perimeter in seconds. Harris gripped the butterfly triggers. He didn't think about the captain's orders. He didn't think about the depression stops lying on the floor. He thought about the physics. He squeezed his thumbs. When Harris squeezed the butterfly triggers at 05:16, the world inside the turret didn't just get loud. It ended. The M45 quad mount didn't fire like a normal machine gun with a rhythmic, mechanical staccato. It roared, the 4 heavy barrels, firing out of sync, created a continuous, ripping noise that sounded like a giant sheet of canvas being torn in half by the hands of an angry god. The recoil force was massive, shaking the half-track on its suspension and vibrating Harris's teeth until his jaw ached. But he didn't let go. He held the triggers down, unleashing a stream of lead that defied the laws of infantry combat. Down in the fatal funnel, the effect was instantaneous and horrific. The first wave of the banzai charge, nearly 200 men sprinting shoulder to shoulder, didn't fall down. They evaporated. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, hit the massive bodies with the force of sledgehammers. A single round could tear a man in half. 4 guns firing together put 50 rounds into the kill zone every second. The front rank of the Japanese charge simply turned into a pink mist, a spray of biological matter that hung in the humid air like fog. The men behind them didn't trip over bodies, they tripped over parts. The physics of the eraser mix began to work exactly as Harris had calculated. The black-tipped armor-piercing rounds didn't stop when they hit a soldier. They punched through the chest of the first man, the helmet of the second, and the tree trunk behind the third. The blue-tipped incendiary rounds followed instantly, striking the shattered timber and the ruined flesh, igniting small, white-hot fires that hissed in the wet grass. The clearing Harris had cut with an axe was instantly transformed into a slaughterhouse lit by the strobe light flashes of the muzzle blasts. For the first 60 seconds, the Japanese didn't understand what was happening. They were used to fighting against bolt-action rifles and water-cooled machine guns that overheated and jammed. They expected gaps in the fire. They expected reload pauses, but the quad mount didn't pause. It was fed by the 4 tombstone drums, giving Harris a continuous stream of hate that lasted for long, agonizing minutes. The attackers running into the funnel were blind, deafened by the noise, and shredding themselves against a wall of lead they couldn't see until it was too late. Harris worked the turret like a fire hose. He didn't aim at individual targets, he aimed at the mass. He swept the guns left and right, the electric motors whining as the turret spun with terrifying speed. The removal of the depression stops allowed him to drag the fire right up to the bumper of the truck. He watched through the smoke as Japanese soldiers dove for cover in the mud, thinking they were safe below the firing line. Harris dipped the barrels. The heavy rounds churned the mud into a slurry, digging the men out of their holes and burying them in the same motion. By minute 3, the jungle edge was unrecognizable. The trees that Harris hadn't cut down were being felled by the bullets. The heavy mahogany trunks shattered under the impact of the AP rounds, sending jagged splinters of wood flying through the air like shrapnel. The vegetation was being mowed down as if by a giant scythe, stripping away the cover and revealing the terrified reserves waiting in the tree line. The Japanese officers, realizing that a frontal assault was suicide, tried to adapt. A whistle blew, barely audible over the roar of the guns. The second wave split, peeling off to the left and right, trying to flank the devil machine in the center. They moved into the darkness, looking for the blind spots of the turret. Harris saw the movement. He didn't panic. He spun the turret hard to the left. The Maxim mount was designed to track Zero fighters diving at 300 miles per hour. Tracking infantry running through mud was child's play. The turret whipped around, the barrels chasing the flanking squad. Harris clamped down on the triggers again. The stream of fire caught them in the open, cutting them down before they could reach the tree line. He spun right, repeating the process. The turret was a swivel chair of death, and Harris was checking every corner of the office. Inside the command bunker, the captain who had called the turret useless was watching the display with his mouth open. He had expected a hard fight. He had expected hand-to-hand combat in the trenches. Instead, he was watching a single mechanic dismantle an entire battalion. The infantry in the foxholes stopped firing. They didn't need to shoot. They just watched the light show, their faces illuminated by the muzzle flashes, witnessing a level of mechanical violence that made their rifles look like toys. By minute 5, the heat was becoming a problem. The 4 barrels of the Brownings were glowing a dull, angry cherry red. The oil on the receivers was smoking, filling the cab with a sharp, acrid stench that burned Harris's eyes. The air inside the turret was toxic, a mix of exhaust fumes from the generator and propellant gas from the guns. Harris was coughing, his lungs screaming for fresh air, but he couldn't stop. If he stopped, the barrels would warp. If he stopped, the Japanese would regroup. He had to keep the steel hot. A Japanese mortar team managed to set up in a crater 50 yards back. Harris saw the flash of the tube launching around. The shell landed wide, splashing mud against the side of the half-track. They were dialing in the range. Harris knew he had seconds before the next round dropped right into his lap. He traced the trajectory back to the flash. He couldn't see the men, but he could see the log they were hiding behind. He focused all 4 guns on the log. The concentrated fire of the quad mount acted like a chainsaw. The wood disintegrated, flying apart in a shower of sparks and chips. The rounds punched through the cover and silenced the mortar team instantly. There was no need to check for a kill. Nothing survived that volume of fire. By minute 10, the banzai charge had lost its momentum, but it hadn't lost its ferocity. The Japanese were desperate now. They realized they couldn't retreat, and they couldn't advance. Their only hope was to overwhelm the gun by sheer weight of numbers. A final, massive group broke from the trees, not screaming this time, but moving with a grim, silent determination. They threw smoke grenades, trying to blind the gunner. Harris was ready. He couldn't see through the smoke, but he knew the geometry of the fatal funnel. He knew where the ground was. He locked the elevation at knee height and began to traverse back and forth, grazing fire that swept the area blindly. He listened to the impacts. He could hear the difference between bullets hitting mud and bullets hitting meat. It was a wet, slapping sound that turned his stomach, but he kept his thumbs pressed down. The ammunition drums ran dry at minute 12. The sudden silence was louder than the gunfire. The barrels hissed, steam rising from the cooling jackets as the rain hit the hot metal. Harris didn't freeze. He scrambled out of the seat, slipping on the pile of spent brass casings that carpeted the floor of the cab. He grabbed 4 fresh tombstone drums from the rack. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped one, crushing his finger against the steel deck. He didn't feel the pain. He hauled the heavy drum up, locked it into place, and fed the belt. He did it 3 more times, moving with the frantic, jerky speed of a man who knows the wolf is at the door. He climbed back into the seat just as a Japanese officer, screaming and waving a katana, climbed onto the hood of the half-track. The man had survived the gauntlet. He was 10 feet away, his face a mask of mud and hate. He raised the sword to smash the windscreen. Harris didn't have time to swing the turret. He grabbed the charging handle of the top left gun and racked it. He didn't use the electric trigger. He reached forward and smashed the manual butterfly trigger on the backplate of the gun with the heel of his hand. The single M10 heavy barrel fired a burst of 3 rounds. The officer was lifted off the hood as if he had been hit by a truck. He landed in the mud 10 yards away. Harris spun the turret, checking for more boarders. There were none. The officer had been the last spark of the fire. By minute 15, the battle was effectively over. The roaring banzai charge had been reduced to a few scattered shots from the tree line. The green wall was gone. In its place was a moonscape of churned mud, shattered trees, and burning fires. The ground in front of the half-track was paved with brass casings and the debris of the attack. Harris took his hands off the triggers. His fingers were locked in a claw shape, cramping from the tension. He leaned back in the bucket seat, gasping for air, listening to the generator engine chug away behind him. He looked down at the floor of the cab. The two rusted bolts, the depression stops, were vibrating in a puddle of oil. Those two pieces of metal were the only reason he was still alive. The infantry captain climbed up onto the side of the half-track. He didn't say anything about the useless turret. He didn't say anything about the broken safety protocols. He looked out at the devastation in the fatal funnel, his face pale in the light of the dying flares. He looked at the smoking barrels of the quadmount, then at the mechanic sitting in the gunner's seat. Harris looked back at him, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He didn't salute. He just pointed at the steam rising from the guns. The message was clear without a word being spoken. The meat chopper is open for business. The battlefield didn't smell like rain anymore. It smelled of copper, burnt powder, and the sickeningly sweet scent of roasted pork. Harris leaned over the side of the tub and vomited into the mud. The adrenaline dump hit him like a physical blow, leaving him shaking and weak. He wasn't a hero. He was just a mechanic who had figured out how to make the machine do what it was born to do. He wiped his mouth with the back of his greasy glove and reached for the canteen. The water tasted like rust, but it was the best thing he had ever drank. Silence didn't come to the northern perimeter of Luzon gently. It fell like a heavy curtain, muffling the ringing in Sergeant Harris's ears and amplifying the wet, sucking sounds of the jungle floor. Sitting in the gunner's bucket seat, his hands still locked in a claw-like grip around the butterfly triggers, Harris felt the adrenaline drain out of his system like dirty water from a cracked radiator. The vibration of the 4 heavy machine guns had stopped, but his body was still humming, vibrating with a phantom energy that made his teeth chatter and his vision blur. Below him, the generator engine sputtered and died, suffocated by the lack of fuel, leaving the turret in a sudden, jarring quiet that felt louder than the gunfire. Climbing out of the tub was a physical struggle, his legs feeling like they were made of lead pipes rather than muscle. He slipped on the carpet of hot brass casings that covered the floor of the half-track, the metal shells tinkling like wind chimes as they cascaded over the side of the vehicle and into the mud. Leaning over the armor plate, he retched dryly, his stomach turning inside out from the toxic cocktail of propellant fumes, burnt oil, and the sickening, sweet smell of the battlefield. It wasn't the smell of rotting vegetation anymore. It was the smell of a butcher shop left out in the sun. Dawn broke over the perimeter 30 minutes later, the sun burning through the mist to reveal the true scale of the fatal funnel. The infantry soldiers, who had spent the night huddling in their foxholes praying for the sun, slowly emerged from the mud, their faces pale and drawn. They walked toward the tree line with a hesitant, shuffling gait, their rifles held at the low ready, expecting to find wounded survivors or booby traps. But as they reached the edge of the clearing Harris had cut, they stopped. They lowered their weapons, they took off their helmets. The jungle didn't exist anymore. The area in front of the half-track, a cone stretching 200 yards deep into the timber, had been erased. The massive mahogany trees, some as thick as telephone poles, hadn't just been cut down. They had been shredded, turned into piles of splintered toothpicks that littered the ground. The vegetation was gone, stripped away to reveal the red clay earth underneath, and mixed into that churned earth was the Japanese attack force. There were no bodies to count in the center of the funnel. The physics of the eraser mix, the 4-to-1 ratio of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, had done exactly what Harris calculated. The heavy .50 caliber bullets, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, hadn't just killed the men. They had disassembled them. The kinetic energy had liquefied the charge, turning the mass of soldiers into a red mist that coated the shattered stumps and the mud. Walking through the devastation, the American infantrymen stepped carefully, their boots sinking into a slurry that was no longer just dirt. They didn't speak, there were no jokes, no souvenir hunting. They just looked back at the half-track sitting on the ridge, the 4 barrels of the quadmount pointing down like accusing fingers. The infantry captain climbed up the side of the half-track later that morning. He didn't look like the arrogant officer who had called the turret a lightning rod the night before. He looked older, he looked shaken. Standing on the running board, he stared at the rusted bolts lying on the floor of the cab, the depression stops Harris had removed to save their lives. He picked one up, turning the heavy piece of steel over in his hand, feeling the weight of the rules they had broken. He didn't say a word, he simply dropped the bolt into his pocket, nodded to Harris, and walked away. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a commendation. It was an acknowledgement that the book on infantry tactics had just been rewritten by a mechanic with a wrench. The legacy of the M45 quadmount was cemented that night in the mud of Luzon. It stopped being just an anti-aircraft gun and became the meat chopper, the ultimate ground support weapon for a war that had become savage and close. The tactic of lowering the boom, removing the depression stops, and using the guns to sweep the jungle became standard procedure for units fighting in the dense foliage of the Pacific. The Japanese learned to fear the silhouette of the half-track more than they feared tanks. A tank fired one shell and waited. The quadmount fired a wall of lead that didn't stop until everything in front of it was dead. The weapon system didn't retire when the Japanese surrendered. It evolved. In Korea, mounted on the back of trucks and tanks, it cut down human waves of Chinese infantry on frozen ridges. In Vietnam, mounted on deuce-and-a-half trucks in convoys, it became the Kropmor, the only thing that could punch through the dense bamboo to stop an ambush. It remained in service for decades, a testament to the brutal efficiency of putting 4 heavy machine guns on a power-driven mount. But for Sergeant Harris, the war didn't end with a parade or a medal ceremony. He was rotated out of the line a week later, his hearing permanently damaged, his hands shaking with a tremor that would never fully go away. He didn't talk about the night on the perimeter. He didn't tell stories at the bar about how he had stopped a banzai charge single-handed. He went back to the motor pool, fixing engines, changing oil, burying himself in the simple, logical world of mechanics where things made sense. Returning to civilian life in Ohio, Harris worked at a Ford plant for 30 years, building transmissions. He was a quiet man, the kind of neighbor who fixed your lawnmower and refused to take money for it. He rarely went to the VFW hall. He never went hunting. When his grandchildren asked him what he did in the war, he would just say he was a mechanic. He told them he fixed trucks. He never told them about the red mist or the sound of the banzai charge being erased by the roar of the meat chopper. We rescue these stories not to glorify the slaughter, but to remember the desperate ingenuity of the men who were forced to become monsters to survive. We tell them because it is easy to look at a black and white photo of a half-track and see a machine. It is harder to see the man sitting in the plastic bucket seat, soaked in rain and fear, making a calculation that would save 1,000 lives and haunt his own for the rest of his days. We need to remember that the difference between victory and massacre often comes down to a single soldier refusing to accept that a situation is hopeless. Harris died in 1994, passing away in his sleep in the house he had built with his own hands. His family found a small box in the back of his workbench drawer. Inside wasn't a medal or a photo of his squad. It was a single, rusted hex head bolt, heavy and scarred, the thread stripped from where he had forced it out of the steel. It was the only souvenir he had kept, a physical reminder of the night he broke the rules and the world broke with them. If this deep dive into the mechanical fury of the meat chopper and the mechanic who unleashed it moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps us fight the algorithm and keeps these forgotten histories from fading into the static. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from the archives. We are digging through the files every week to find the heroes who fought their battles alone. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Was Harris right to modify the gun against orders, or was the captain right to worry about the risks? Would you have pulled those triggers? We want to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the US, Europe, or somewhere else? You are the keepers of this history just as much as we are. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure the meat chopper never rusts in silence. We'll see you in the next one.